And the cycle continues with every upcoming Spider-Man film, speculating on the villains. So after the ending for Spider-Man Far From Home, it does give us a good indicator on what the plot for the third film will be centered around. And for those who had stuck around for the end credits would know that Spider-Man's identity is pretty much common knowledge, as it was exposed from the Daily Bugle by Mysterio. And since Spider-Man is framed for the apparent death of Mysterio, the story for the third film will most likely center around Spider-Man being on the run from a group of villains who would want his head. And with that plot thread in mind, I did speculate on who the next villain should be for Spider-Man 3, and as much as I would want to include the Sinister Six on here, it would kinda be predictable, and I do want to spice things up and focus more on the individuals. Not to say that the Sinister Six is implausible for Spider-Man 3, in fact if anything I do feel like there's a pretty good chance that it might happen, but honestly I want to focus on the films that kinda fit the plot thread the best. Now the first film that comes to my mind, and is quite possibly the film that I want to see the most, is none other than The Scorpion. And given the fact that Scorpion is a highly requested villain for Spider-Man to face within a future film, I do feel like Scorpion is a pretty safe bet. And it's also debatably the most likely choice, because for starters they've already established Mac Gargan in Homecoming, and after the end of the movie we do know that he does have a bone to pick with Spider-Man. So already they have planted the seeds for him to eventually become Scorpion within a future film. But not only that, we also saw the inclusion of J. Jonah Jameson in Spider-Man Far From Home, and if you follow the comics then you would know that he is somewhat responsible for the origin of Scorpion, and which led into a rivalry between J. Jonah Jameson and Mac Gargan. And since the third film will most likely deal with Spider-Man being on the run due to his secret identity being exposed, this could lead to Mac Gargan being released by J. Jonah Jameson and then have his Scorpion armor in order to hunt down Spider-Man, in which is somewhat reminiscent of the Scorpion's first appearance. Not to mention that in the earlier comics, Scorpion was somewhat depicted as the anti-Spider-Man, only being much stronger, faster, and could even beat him from time to time. And with that, I do feel like the Scorpion would be the perfect villain for Spider-Man 3. And to sort of segue into my next choice for Spider-Man villain for the third film, I do suggest Alistair Smythe. And while he is somewhat of a B-list Spider-Man villain, I do feel like there is a lot of potential for him to really stand out in a Spider-Man movie. Because for starters, within a somewhat newer storyline, I do recall Alistair Smythe giving Mac Gargan a more enhanced Scorpion armor. So already you can tie both Scorpion and Alistair Smythe in one movie. Plus, Alistair Smythe is responsible for the creation of the Spider Slayers, and the Spider Slayers alone could really fit in perfectly with the current narrative that was set in motion for Spider-Man 3. As the main purposes for the Spider Slayers is to of course track down Spider-Man. And surprisingly enough, we have yet to see Spider-Man face off against a mad scientist in the MCU, so I do feel like if you want to change the norm and do a mad scientist, I feel like Alistair Smythe would actually be a breath of fresh air. And hell, maybe they could introduce Alistair Smythe as an employee of Oscorp and maybe even build up Norman Osborn from there. And the last villain that comes to mind is a no-brainer at this point, because Kraven the Hunter deserves his due in the movies, and I do feel like with this plot thread in mind, I feel like this is the perfect opportunity to introduce him to the MCU. And while Kraven the Hunter isn't necessarily my favourite Spider-Man villain per se, the fanbase surrounding this character is massive, and at this point he is pretty much the most heavily requested villain for a Spider-Man film. And granted, someone will argue in saying that Kraven is reserved for Sony for their own Kraven movie, but they pretty much said the same thing about Mysterio, and look how that turned out. Plus his motivations aren't exactly that difficult to understand, given that Kraven is just a hunter who tracks down his prey just for sport, and to prove that he is just simply better than his prey. And so he really isn't that difficult to nail in a movie. And if they were to exclude Kraven the Hunter for Spider-Man 3, given the storyline, then I feel like this is a massive missed opportunity, as this would have been the perfect time into introducing Kraven the Hunter. But given the fact that we traditionally have a brand new Spider-Man movie every 2.5 years, not to mention that Marvel Studios has a ton of announcements for both D23 as well as San Diego Comic-Con, I do feel like we are gonna get some sort of revelation sooner rather than later. And to me, it's always exciting to see which Spider-Man film will be introduced next within the movies, because it's always interesting to see how well they are translated for the big screen. So what are your thoughts on my speculations for the Spider-Man villains who might show up for Spider-Man 3, and what are your personal favourite villains that you would want to see for the next film? Comment below and share some thoughts, and as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, take care and have a good one.